All right, so who's been excited this whole semester because we've been talking about sensory systems? And that's been great, right? But we've talked about each one of those sort of independently. And what I'd like to do today, briefly, this is going to be a short lecture, briefly, I'd like to talk about multisensory processing, putting all of these together, because when you walk around in the world, you're not processing one sense at a time, right? It's not like Olivia goes, she's like, okay, I'm going to take in all the visual stuff. Got it. Now give me all the auditory. All right, now let me feel. No, you're doing it all simultaneously, and you're using that information in some integrated fashion, right? So that you can make a nice, coherent perception of the world, right? And that's what's awesome. So we're going to talk about that today. There are only 19 slides, so that's awesome. We do want to introduce this concept of modular processing, right? And what do we mean by modular processing? If things are set up in modules, right, what we would mean by that is that each module can be optimized for a specific function, right? Okay. And there is some like maximum speed and efficiency of that module, and that's not going to be compromised because you're trying to do multiple things at the same time, right? So this is sort of like the ace of one trade, jack of all trades sort of concept, right? We want something that works for this specific purpose, right? How many of you have a like a specialized tool or device that just does? Well, let's think about this. How many of you? Anybody do hiking, camping? Anybody have like a Leatherman or a Gerber? You guys know what I'm talking about? Like those multi-tools. Yeah, Laura, you know what I'm talking about.
I thought a Gerber was for like babies.
You got stickers.
I got
Gerber.
stickers.
It's a brand. You people from Maryland.
New Hampshire. Close.
Upper Maryland. I had a college roommate who was from Upper Maryland. It's like Maryland's this tall. What's the upper part?
Not these.
No, I think, yeah. Not Baltimore. That's what he meant. It's like, I'm not from Baltimore. That's the rest of Maryland is Upper Maryland. There's Baltimore and then there's Upper Maryland. I mean, he was almost from Delaware, I think. He went to high school in Delaware. Anyway, so, Laura, do you want to take 20, 30 minutes to tell them what we're talking about here?
No, not really.
So basically it's kind of like a pair of pliers, but a bunch of stuff comes out of the handle. Like a saw and a fish scaler and tweezers and like a knife and a screwdriver, right? And that's kind of like it's kind of handy, right? Because you've got like one thing, but it does all of these things. The problem is it doesn't do any of them really well, right? If I really want a nice pair of pliers, like I'm actually going to be doing some work on a car or something I'm putting together, I go get a real pair of pliers that just, you know, grabs onto stuff, right? Just plies, right? Just plies. I get a screwdriver and I can, you know, like have different bits, right? Instead of just like, well, that's a flat thing, I think it'll work. So, modular processing are these individual specialized sort of units. They're designed specifically for one purpose, right? If you have something that is, you know, doing many things, right? Like one of those multi-tools, it doesn't do any of them perfectly. It does a lot of things, right? So if we can have these modules, that's pretty awesome. Think about this in sensory processing, right? How many of you have eyes? And what do you do with those? You see things. You're not hearing things with them, right? You're not taking in all of your sensory information through one apparatus, right? You're getting part of it through your eyes, you're getting some of it through your ears, you're getting tactile stimulation, right, through your you know, cutaneous receptors and so forth, right? So we have these different sort of modules, which is kind of interesting. The other nice thing is if there's an error in one of your modules, it stays in that module, right? So if you have a problem with your vision, that doesn't affect your hearing, your taste, your smell, right? It just affects your vision, okay? If I break my pliers, I can still use my saw or my knife, right? Because they're separate tools, okay? So they have these separate units, separate functions, right? So we're not, you know, not really propagating these. The other thing is you can pretty easily add new functions just by adding a new module, right? So Laura, do you have a Gerber or a Leatherman multi-tool? But you know what I'm talking about, right? So if you have one, can you add on features to it once you have? You can, right? It's self-contained. It is what it is. It just is, right? It does whatever it does, and that's it. But let's say you wanted to add, you know, a special screwdriver bit to that, a torque wrench or something. Well, if it's not on there when you bought it, it's not going to be on there. You have to buy a separate tool for that, right? So you have to add these separate modules.
The modules, trying to figure out how to work this. Is it done at like a cellular level, or is it like It's more like connecting between like finding specific sounds or sights or something, or?
So I think broadly, let's think about these modules just in the sort of the major sensory functions that we have, right? Vision, hearing, taste, smell, touch, and they do have separate biological pathways, right? And so they're not necessarily interfering with each other if we're thinking about it just strictly as modular process, right? Does that make sense? And you could probably even, in some cases, you could go a little deeper with that if you really, especially in vision, if you wanted to think about maybe color vision processing versus motion vision processing. That gets a little tougher because it's harder to say that each one's an independent module and a problem with one doesn't bleed over into the other, right? And you can kind of see how color vision and motion vision use some of the same processes, right? So that may not be something that we can divide out as a modular. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here we go. This is just a basic map showing you sort of visual areas and somatosensory areas and auditory areas, just saying, well, we have different parts of your brain that handle different kinds, different modalities, right? So different modules for that sensory system. All right. Now, one of the problems with the way we've approached this class is that, you know, natural objects and events are typically multisensory, right? If you think about this room, it's multisensory, right? There are auditory stimulation, there's visual stimulation, tactile, and not just like touch, but your temperature, right? Some of you might be in pain. Those seats are the most uncomfortable chairs imaginable. Every time I sit in one, my ribs hurt. Does that happen to anybody else?
Could be posture.
Well, you can't have posture in those chairs. I mean, it's just, like, lean back, like, if you want the back to support you. Like, lean on. How can you write notes like that? You can't, right? That's just uncomfortable. It's just uncomfortable. Horrible design. Butt buckets.
Don't watch them all. You know why? Because they were cheap as shit.
Yeah. No, I'm not arguing with you about it. So, natural objects are typically multisensory, right? So what are we doing? So if we're doing multisensory research, we're going to present to you a stimulus in two different domains or multiple domains at the same time, right? And we're going to ask you, hey, does that change your performance, right? If we just give you an auditory stimulus, but then we give you an auditory stimulus and a visual stimulus, how does that change your performance, right? And then we can figure out if it's actually modular processing or not, right? Because if every modality, if every type of sensory information, every bit of that is processed separately, then you're not going to have any sort of alteration in your performance just because that other type of stimulus is there, right? Does that make sense? If vision and audition are processed completely separately, if I present a visual and an auditory stimulus at the same time, your performance on discriminating or detecting the visual or auditory stimulus will be the same as if it was presented alone. Does that make sense? Okay. If not, then we know that there's some kind of crosstalk there, right? And what we do know, here's a spoiler alert, multisensory stimulation does improve detectability, right? It can alter stimulus identity and it can shift your perceived location. So that means these modules do not operate independently, right? How many of you remember when we talked about taste and we said if you are given a beverage, right, and it's strawberry flavored, and we put red dye in that, you will indicate that it tastes more powerfully like strawberries than if it is not as red, right? That clearly tells you there's some interaction, in this case, between visual information and gustatory information. Does that make sense? It's pretty simple, right? Kind of a straightforward story. All right, so what about detection? So there's like a couple things we want to do with the stimulus. We might detect that as stimulus, right? If we give you two types of stimuli, right, two different modalities, it'll actually speed up reaction time, right? So if we give you an auditory and a visual stimulus, you'll be able to locate that visual stimulus faster. You'll be able to detect it faster, more easily, right? Because you're going to have that auditory stimulus kind of drawing your attention there as well, right? And in a couple weeks, we'll actually talk about attention and attention mechanisms, right? So don't think too much about that right now. Kind of hold off a couple weeks, but we'll talk about that, right? So there you go. This is particularly true if we give you that auditory stimulus on the same side as the visual target, right? So don't worry too much about this particular thing, but when the auditory and the visual stimulus are on the same side, it increases detectability. It makes it easier for you to detect that. And if you can think about taking your sensory resources and kind of spatially locating them, right? Now, do you think that would work as well if I presented to you what if I gave you a gustatory stimulus and a visual stimulus at the same time? Do you think that would be as helpful? Probably not, right? And if you think about this for a moment, what do we do with vision? We locate where things are. What do we do with audition?
Here.
And we locate where things are, right? We did visual location, and remember that visual or that auditory localization lab, right? So they're both giving you spatial information, and that spatial information work together. Gustatory information, Charlotte, that's not really. I mean, you're eating pizza. Is that really telling you where something is? I mean, obviously you know where the pizza is, right? You crammed it right in your mouth, but it's not giving you any information about anything else, right? Like, I'm going to eat pizza at the same time that I'm driving, and I'm going to be able to see those kids running across the street back there, right? Right? Yeah. Mason seems to think that's the way it works, right? You teach driving safety.
It's Darwinism at that point.
I'm not sure that's how it works, but we'll go with it, I guess. Right?
See.
So I think if you were to do this with a different sensory modality, maybe it wouldn't work as well, right? Like all of a sudden you smell roses and then you can see things better. I don't think it works that way. Because again, we're not really, the spatial information's not there, right? So I want to think about that. What about for identification? What are some things that are cool here? Sound and touch, right? This is kind of cool. Who loves the word perturbing? Nobody's raising their hand on perturbing. So when you change the sounds that are made, how many of you have ever rubbed your hands together? Right? And you've made some sound, right? If you change the way that sounds, right? So if you make that louder or scratchier or smoother, that will actually make you sort of change the way that you perceive the smoothness of your skin, right? So I imagine if you're somebody who so let's think about why that might be, right? If you think about somebody who, a professional porcupine juggler, but I imagine they're going to have really rough, calloused hands, right? And so if they rub their hands together, it's going to make a lot of noise. I'm going to think of someone who has really smooth hands, like Shaq. I mean, he uses that Gold Bond lotion all the time. He's got to have smooth skin. So I imagine when he rubs his hands together, you don't even hear anything.
Shaq and a porcupine juggler.
Yeah. But you know what you're going to do, Mason? You're not going to forget that example. And you're probably going to think about Shaq juggling porcupines. And if they would give him $85 and a free porcupine, he would endorse that. I think that's his threshold.
Oh.
He's entertaining, though.
What did he do to you?
He lost.
Nothing, I guess, yet. Oh, I tell you what he did to me. He made that movie Kazam, and I had to watch that as a kid. That's what he did to me.
What the hell is Kazam?
Yeah, you don't want to know. Don't bother.
So now we want to know.
Save your time. It was Shaq playing a genie.
So it's like William, what's his face playing?
Will Smith.
Will Smith.
Yeah, but that was like a movie with a plot.
I thought that
and
was like a
production.
Mandela effect.
That's Sinbad.
Okay,
Yeah, that's what you're talking about there. Yeah, no, Shaq was actually in this movie called Kazam.
that's good.
That really happened. Sinbad has never played a genie in a movie. That didn't happen. That's a whole I know, right? Just leave it out there. So, sound and touch. What about smell and color? We already talked about strawberry taste, but smells the same thing with the color. Sound and light, right? If you present noise and light, it tends to be louder than if the noise is presented alone, right? So if you're just like kapow, and then you have like kapow, but a light comes on, that noise is going to seem louder to you, right? Yeah, right? It's the same concept. Okay. What about touch and light, right? Tactile discrimination thresholds are lower during visual observation. So what do we mean? If you touch something, while you're looking at it, you're going to have a better idea of what that texture is. Localization. Well, this is kind of fun stuff, right? How many of you love ventriloquists?
It's not creepy.
Jeff Dunham pretty much killed him all.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, I feel like every time I give this lecture, Jeff Dunham has been or is coming to town, but I also feel like Jeff Dunham's here every 3 weeks. Like, I don't, I feel like he's, like, since I moved here like 5 years ago, I think he's done like 6 shows. I don't think it's been that many, but you could look it up. Is he here all the time, or is it just me? Like, I saw
I
one
know he was
billboard that
here
never
at
changed.
least twice, because I went to one of his shows and then I heard about another one that I missed.
Okay, so he has been
That
here.
wasn't in order, but
So you missed the first one, and then you
Yeah.
went to the second one? Okay.
Probably because we're the only state that's taken.
I don't know. I don't know. But, so ventriloquists, right? So if they're good, they don't move their mouths, but they move some other mouth way over here, right? You sort of perceive that's where the sound's coming from. Here is another ventriloquist that you didn't know existed, the TV. Who said that? Somebody say TV? I really heard that, Shane, but I'm going to blame you. So your television works this way.
TV.
The TV. How many of you have ever watched TV?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, right? And there's usually like
Only on Sundays.
right here, there's like a big round thing that looks like this, and there are like words coming out of it, right? There's usually like a person's
Dad.
head.
What are those things? What?
Those are his ears.
Well, no, I'm talking about your bass clef things you got going on down there.
This?
There's arms.
Oh, those are his shoulders, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's like his shirt.
Oh, okay.
oh, that's a neck.
Yeah, this is a neck. I don't know
That
why you
little
guys.
dot, his Adam's apple?
Is that better?
Yeah.
And then he didn't shave today, so we'll put a little butterfly shadow.
There you go.
Maybe he tried to shave and failed.
Or he cut himself and that's all
Yeah.
it was.
So, the mouth is moving in the middle of the screen, but where are the speakers?
On the sides,
Well, yeah,
usually.
yeah, not in the middle of the screen, right? But you perceive the sound as coming from the middle of the screen where the guy's face is, right? Or I guess we can make that a woman's face if we.
That makes surround sound very interesting idea. Like especially if you have like surround sound like in the corners, in the vertices of your ceiling,
Mhm.
like where the walls meet the ceiling. Like I feel like that's a very interesting idea for art to us.
Yeah, no, it is exactly. You're absolutely right, and I think folks who design these televisions and entertainment systems, folks in the film industry, and not the folks who are necessarily the sound engineers collecting the sound during the movie, but the folks who are playing the sound back to you as you're in the theater, right? They have to think about all of this stuff, and all of this really interacts there. So if any of you were wanting to be a projectionist or work at Best Buy and install speakers, right here you go. This class is going to be important for you.
Have you ever heard like one of those? Have you ever heard like one of those audio files that are like 360 like surround sound, but all you have to do is put in your ear plugs?
Please. I mean, somebody's going to talk to me about like what was
Is it
it?
crazy?
Marissa, you know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to be really upset about it. They take these music files and they're like, hey, this is like an 8D music. Is that what it's called? 4D?
I know what
They
you're.
take these
But-
music
but-
files and it just like sounds like it's moving around. I'm like, I don't know what that really adds to me.
It's like 8D
I've never heard
audio
of
or
this.
something
Yeah,
like
8D
that.
audio. It's
I don't know.
So
Play
it's-
something in AD.
yeah, it's not. I
It's
think
the
you have
best,
to.
like,
You have to have headphones in because you have to really limit the input that's coming from one place or the other. Essentially, there's like, you listen to music, right, and it's coming in kind of on both sides typically, right? But when you listen to this 8D, it's like, you hear it on one side and then it kind of sounds like it's moving to the other side and then it sounds like it's like moving back, like.
Like I heard one. I came across one on Tumblr and it was like a visit to the barber shop and it freaked me out. It
Yeah.
sounded like the razor was right near my head and there was nothing there. I was like, I need to stop. I feel like that was.
Oh, I want to do
a
something
weird
more.
experience.
No, I didn't hear the barber shop. Somebody made me listen to, I feel like it was Tom Petty. And I don't know why I needed to listen to Tom Petty sounding like he was running around in my head. It just didn't really add anything to my experience, but, whatever. Maybe some people are into that.
Is that sort of like, is it sort of similar to ASMR?
Well, some people identify as furries, but
ASMR.
Like,
oh god.
he knows what I'm talking about. Like, the best example I can think of is there are sort of like these speakers, sort of. They're literally shaped like human ears. And then one person has a set of headphones in that are attached to those speakers, and they're super, super sensitive, like almost human ear sensitive. So like, they can be in a completely different room and then just be hearing, like, if one person's talking in this ear, it will sound like they're talking to them in that room, in that ear
It's meant to be
specifically.
like therapeutic, like if
Yeah.
it's typing on the keyboard, like you just hear the keyboard noises or.
Oh, it's like the,
Amplify different sounds.
it's the Bob
Yeah.
Ross people. It's the Bob Ross.
Oh, we ain't talking about the Bob Ross people?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Like some people like listen to Bob Ross because his voice has the same, and it's like they crinkle up water bottles or somebody like
Yeah.
makes like funky noises or whatever.
Oh, alright.
It's the same thing. It's all in the same category if we're not going to talk about it.
It's not very adamantly opposed Bob Ross people.
You didn't like the label Bob Ross people?
I
What
didn't like
life
that.
are you living?
What do you mean?
I don't know, like,
The
you
Bob
just
Ross
speak
era.
and I get confused.
You just
It's the, you don't know about the Bob Ross people? Just type that into Google. I'm sure something will come up.
Probably only Bob Ross.
So there are folks who listen. You know Bob Ross, right?
Yeah, I know
Yeah,
who Bob
like back
Ross is.
before he
It's
was
the
like-
people that's confusing me.
Back before he was like socks and a Funko Pop figure, he was a dude who was on like PBS painting, right? And like,
Yeah.
and before that even, he was like a painting instructor, right? So that's like what he did. He taught people to paint. The super cool thing about Bob Ross though is he was like really laid. Actually, he was not really laid back. He portrayed himself really laid back on TV, right? So his voice has this sort of interesting. I think between his voice and the way he kind of like jabs the brush going up, right, and it creates that happy little trees, right? And so he creates this sort of interesting sort of auditory stimulus, right? And some people find that very, very soothing and therapeutic, right? It's like, as you said, I mean, like keyboard typing, I think is one. And I've even people like crinkling water bottles is another sort of example of this. It's just like a weird. You can look it up.
One question, from like your analysis, what you're saying is ASMR is Bob Ross's cold, correct?
Yeah, it's people who just listen to Bob Ross all the time because he makes them feel
It's a
good.
similar concept.
Not exactly, yeah, I mean, whatever. But they're Bob Ross people, it's the same idea. Yeah, Bob Ross apparently was not a nice guy.
Yeah.
Like, he was really difficult to work with. And you know those paintings that he did? He made like 3 for every show, identical paintings. They weren't happy little accidents, right?
Oh.
He had planned the whole thing and just,
Whichever one he decided.
no, they were all 3 identical. That's how good he was and how detail-oriented he was. He would make 3 identical paintings, and he would like use them at different stages during the filming. So he'd have like the completed one. I know, right? That's nuts. Totally just ruined your Bob Ross.
He was a sweet person.
Nope, he was
Nope.
hateful.
Pee Wee Herman? Devil.
All right, what about mechanisms of cross-modal cueing, right? It's kind of interesting. We can think about that. So how does this work, right? We were asking about these like different sort of cellular pathways, right? And there are actually multisensory zones in your brain, right? There are some places, particularly in the parietal cortex, that are sensory association areas, right? And they're pooling information from multiple sensory modalities together so we can create that coherent perception of the world. Okay? What I want you to get from this slide is that even though we think about places like primary visual cortex, there are sometimes places such as that actually have some multimodal responses, right? Now, I think in general we wouldn't say primary visual cortex is a multimodal location just because there are a few cells that might get excited from an auditory stimulus, right? But there are some cells there that might process some other sort of sensory information as well. I think this is probably more like, how many of you remember lateral inhibition, right? Where we were collecting information from others just to make sure you're actually really getting excited about something, right? And so it's kind of nice to maybe collect some other sensory information just to kind of get a baseline of what kind of information is coming in. Is this something that we really need to be thinking about, or are we actually needing to respond to that, okay? They do these things called ERPs. These are kind of interesting. They measure fluctuations in electrical potentials in your brain. Not a big deal. But there are some audio-visual interactions that are pretty short latency, so they happen pretty quickly. Too quickly, the point from this is it's too quickly, right, for you to have sent that information up to an association area, right? So it's happening in those early sort of separate modality regions. We're still getting some of these audio-visual interactions, right, that early in the process, which is kind of interesting, right? I mean, because everything comes in separate and then we put it together, but if we're getting some interaction before we've put the two sensory signals together, then that's a really interesting thing to think about. All right, who likes synesthesia? Some people, right? Synesthesia is really sort of interesting, right? So we'll talk briefly about this. There are different kinds of synesthesia. The most common is when you have sort of sequences of letters, numbers, things like that, calendars, and you actually see that as a sequence of colors. A lot of folks are like, oh, synesthesia, I can taste blue. Well, yeah, I mean, that happens, but like to one person. The rest of the folks who have synesthesia, they have this other sort of situation, right? Okay. So why would we have synesthesia, right? We'll talk about that. Why would we think that's an important thing? Early on, folks really doubted that synesthesia was real, right? I mean, if somebody comes up to you and they're like, you know, I'm looking at this check and it looks like you wrote that for blue-green dollars. You know, that's not going to make sense to most of us, right? Because we will, you know, you wrote that for $45. That's not blue-green dollars, right? I don't know what you mean by that. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of folks thought that this was a problem when folks were learning to read, right? So when they were learning to read, they associated letters with colors, but that doesn't really seem to be the case because there's that pairings are consistent over time. There's brain imaging studies that say, hey, that's probably not the way it is. And there seems to be some sort of genetic, although folks don't know what genes are involved, but it does seem to be something that has some genetic issue, right? Probably what's happening is those unimodal cortical areas during development are getting sort of crossed up and there are connections from one region to another, right? Even though in most folks they might be weak or not even be present, folks who are synesthetes, right? There you go. That's kind of like an athlete, but they are, you know.
Underpaid.
Underpaid, yeah. Synesthetes are way underpaid. Nobody appreciates them. So that's kind of different. Don't worry about that. So what will synesthesia do for you? A long time ago, folks thought, hey, I bet synesthetes are more creative and they can come up with these awesome ideas. The problem is there's no evidence to indicate that's true. So don't get too worked up on it. However, it does seem that folks with synesthesia are a little bit better at word recall, so they have slightly better memories. So that's kind of interesting, right? And so there's probably, like a lot of things, there's probably some combination of genes that gives you really good recall, and if you have just a tad too much of that combo, then you're going to get synesthesia, right? And so you're kind of right in that balance between, yes, I can remember words, you know, because you don't want to go like too far down and like not remember things. You don't want to go so far that you're like, well, everything looks like colors to me when I look at numbers and sequences. So it's kind of an interesting thing, right? I do want to show you this interesting article. How many of you are familiar with The Onion?
Yep.
Yeah, there's a phenomenal, in case you ever get confused about synesthesia.
Is this a legit article? Because
No.
The Onion has also posted articles like Kim Jong-un voted sexiest man alive.
That's all that The Onion posts.
Right.
I hope you don't think there are any legitimate articles on
No, I know there are.
Okay.
That's why I was
Okay.
like, that's why when I heard you say The Onion posted this article, I'm like,
So I hope you folks can read that. Does that make sense? See, it actually, someone who knows about synesthesia actually wrote this, which is really kind of impressive. You know, like as many as blue % of Americans have yellow or more symptoms of synesthesia, right? So every time there's been a number in this particular story, they've substituted that with a block of color, right? To kind of let you know that's how synesthesia works. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have comments, concerns about that? It is clever. It's very clever, right? I think I like this better than the, you know, Korean dictator, sexiest man alive type article. But that's just me, you know.
But there are only so many colors in a rainbow, and there are like so many numbers. So like how? I don't know. I'm not.
I mean, does it actually make sense? Is it like almost like another language almost?
Wait,
Like, do they actually comprehend
Yeah.
the amount,
Like
the
how
way
we
that
call
I would?
blue blue, but like another language would call it a different name? Is that how that works?
No. So instead of, like, if we were to look at this, there might be like 12, right? And so the sequence 1, 2 to us appears as a 1 and a 2. If you have synesthesia and you see the sequence 1, 2, that appears as a blotch of blue to you.
How do they do math?
Right, so how do they like,
Finger paint.
who comes in and like, gets with them to help them like, I don't know, like understand
Yeah.
that, like if they don't have any concept of numbers.
It's not that they don't have any concept of numbers. It's that certain sequences look like, typically they perceive those as colors.
So they could see like 32
Maybe.
as 32, but 23
To them might
is
be.
purple.
It might be, yeah.
Yeah, so how do they function? Like how do they, I don't know.
They go to the
build-
grocery store and they're like, why is this bread blue dollars? That's great.
It's supposed to be on sale, it's supposed to be green.
Or like, is it like how, like disregarding the whole color thing, it's basically like learning a new language, right? So like they interpret it as how their original
They're not
language
interpreting
is,
any, I mean, they're not really, I mean, there's no original.
but like they understand it as this is what this is. Do they know it's 32 or do they know it's, like because their whole life they've seen 32 as blue, right?
I assume so.
So like it would be like a language in a sense.
Do they see colors the same way? Like,
The same way
any
we
of us
do?
see colors?
Do they
colors
see
as
new
numbers?
colors?
Well, they see.
Not
colors as
necessarily.
colors?
Someone might, but I
Why is there not a lot of
So
like
what if someone's like
study
at a
into
stoplight
this?
and they
Well, because there are like 4 people who have this
Well,
problem.
find them. I want to.
Is this going to be a good question?
Yeah. Can people with synesthesia be colorblind?
Yo, wouldn't that be?
I would assume they could, because I would, but I,
Different genes.
yeah, it's,
Decide at the same time.
yeah, I would assume they could. I don't know that, because there are, I mean, one, there's a small number of people who are colorblind, and there's like an even smaller number of people who are synesthetes, right? There's just not a lot of research on it. So I don't know, if you find a colorblind person who has synesthesia, that would be interesting. And I think you could write a really cool paper on that. And if you do, you can let me know, I'll read it.
And it doesn't, I've heard it goes in like degrees, synesthesia. It doesn't actually do that. That was just false information.
What?
There's a rumor on the internet that one of the dudes from Fall Out Boy has synesthesia, but he barely has it. But you could have a.
Yeah, so, and it's a little different, and that's the other problem. So it's different for everybody, right? So some people, it's only certain sequences of letters or numbers, or like calendars, like days of the week. Like there are some people when they have like, they look at a calendar and they have like the days of the week, they just kind of see like color blocks instead of the names of the days. And so it's different for everybody, and I think that's what makes it a real problem, right? So like if you had the flu, right? Which I don't know, I hope you don't. But if you did, and you go in and you go like, my symptoms are A, B, and C, and then somebody else comes in and says, I've got the flu too, but my symptoms are D, E, and F. And they're like, well, how do you have the flu if you each have different symptoms and none of them are the same, right? And I think that's really the problem with synesthesia. There are so few people who have it. For the longest time, people thought, well, that's just like a made-up thing that's not even real. So we're not even going to bother studying it. It's just like idiots making up stuff. And then now we're like, okay, that's probably real, but it's so different for everybody that we're not really sure what's going on. And so everybody kind of has, it manifests in slightly different ways in everybody. Does that make sense?
Okay, in that case, if it could be varying degrees, could like we all have it and we just don't know it?
I guess. I mean, I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, just look at a calendar, and if it looks like days of the week to you, you're fine. I think that's
But
what
what? How do you know what days of the week looks like to me? What
those
if I think
matter.
it's just normal?
You'll know.
This is stressing me out.
I don't know why. These are a really anxiety-prone group.
Or maybe if like,
She's
it's just
taking your
because,
class.
maybe if it's just like MONDAY, it looks blue, but if you look at it in Spanish, is it the same?
No, because it's gonna be different, a different sequence of letters.
Maybe they also have like context clues, like if it's only a certain sequence of numbers, like, okay, 13 is blue, but 14 and 15 and 12 are all the normal numbers. They can probably fill in the blanks there. I'm assuming.
We can just move on to the.
Or are we talking about a different thing now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the problem is like, every time you see blue, you can't just go, well, that must be 13. I don't know.
Not like that exactly, but like,